Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, an American stained glass legacy. Forward. A significant part of the history of the stained glass industry in the United States over the past 100 years belongs to Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated. The firm, located in Winona, Minnesota, specializes in the design, fabrication, restoration, and protection of leaded stained glass and faceted glass windows. One of the oldest in North America, the firm was formed through the merger of two American stained glass studios, the Willet Stained Glass Studio of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the Hauser Art Glass Company, Incorporated. When the two united in 1977, together they formed one of the largest stained glass studios in North America. In 2005, the company changed its name to Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated, to more accurately reflect the long-term direction of the studio. Its evolution continued on January 9, 2014, when the Arizona-based National Stained Glass Studio Associated Crafts acquired Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated. Chapter 1. The Willett Family. 3 generations of Willets have devoted their lives to what we today recognize as Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated. There is a black and white photo showing the Willett family and studio artisans outside the Willet Stained Glass and Decorating Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. William Willett purchased the Pittsburgh studio from Ludwig Gross. He stands at the center, wearing a black robe. To his right is his wife, fellow artist and business partner, Anne Lee Willett. Their young son, Henry Lee Willett, sits on the ground in front of his bike. William Willett. Studio founder William Willett, 1869 to 1921, was an American portrait painter, muralist, stained glass designer, studio owner, and writer. An early proponent of the Gothic revival and active in the early school of American stained glass, he founded the Willet Stained Glass and Decorating Company with his wife and business partner, Anne Lee Willett. The studio's direction was developed in protest against the opalescent pictorial windows, which were the rage at the turn of the 20th century. Before he began creating works in stained glass, William Willett was a portrait painter with a rather distinguished clientele. He painted portraits for President McKinley and the prominent businessman John Jacob Astor, among others. He studied painting with the American Impressionist artist William Merritt Chase before assisting in the studio of muralist John Lafarge between 1885 and 1887. There, he served as studio art director and assisted in painting mural portraits. In 1896, he married fellow artist Anne Lee, and the couple moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he served as art director for the stained glass firm of Ludwig Gross from 1897 to 1898. Later that same year, he and Anne started their studio, the Willet Stained Glass and Decorating Company. Together, the couple pioneered the renaissance of leaded antique glass, a characteristic of medieval stained glass in the United States during a time when opalescent glass was in vogue. William believed that opalescent glass did not fulfill the purpose of a window and therefore did not harmonize with the principles of architecture. A deeply religious man, he created work that honored the artists of the Middle Ages who came before him in both aesthetic and subject. Given his love for traditional European work and the pre-Raphaelite movement, William was active in what stained glass artist and writer Charles J. Connick termed the early school of stained glass. It was in direct contrast to the American school, a movement established by Louis Comfort Tiffany and John Lafarge, identified by its use of opalescent glass. Enamored with the medieval technique of transparent antique glass, he wrote and lectured extensively on the subject and exhibited work at many leading salons throughout the country. William and fellow craftsmen Otto Heinecke and Harry Goodhue are credited with renewing America's interest in traditional European medieval aesthetic, materials, and techniques. Among his many accomplishments in glass, he is responsible for creating the first medallion window in the United States in the First Presbyterian Church of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the second in Pittsburgh's Calvary Episcopal Church. His first medallion window was composed of antique stained glass in the medieval manner for his friend and mentor, Theophilus P. Chandler, architect and first dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. The church's senior pastor, Dr. Maitland Alexander, found the work to be archaic and cheap, however, and ordered that the window be covered with heavy canvas and a great organ placed before it. Before it was hidden from view, it caught the attention of neo-Gothic architect Ralph Adams Cram, who would later serve as a patron for many of the Willett's works, including his work at U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Upon viewing the Willett Sanctuary window in the Calvary Church in 1909, Cram is said to have regarded the medallion window as one of the most notable examples of the revival of the fundamental principles of the art. Waxing poetic about Willett's use of color, composition, and harmonious design, Cram regarded it as an extremely high type of art, rivaling only the windows created at the height of the artistic period of stained glass in France during the 12th century. William's work at West Point and the great west window he and Anne designed and created together for Proctor Hall at Princeton University are also considered two of his greatest works. William Willett died on March 29, 1921, at the age of 52, after suffering a relapse from a heart dilation which began in October of 1920. He is buried in Witherspoon Cemetery in Princeton, New Jersey. He was considered to be one of the most important stained glass artists in America. Referring to a picture on the left, the loose brushwork and emphasis on the effects of light in William Willett's Baptism of Christ rendering reflect the influence of his early mentor, American Impressionist artist William Merritt Chase, had on the young artist's work. The portrait on the top is a portrait of Rachel Marshall Willett, an example of the artist's portraiture work. The next two images exemplify what Charles Connick described as the early and American schools of stained glass in the United States at the turn of the century. Both windows depict post-crucifixion scenes. At the left is William and Anne Lee Willett's Resurrection window for St. Matthew's Catholic Church, Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. At the right, Louis Comfort Tiffany's Ascension window for College Hill Presbyterian Church, Easton, Pennsylvania. Anne Lee Willett. After her husband's untimely death, his widow and business partner, Anne Lee Willett, 1867 to 1943, along with their son Henry, assumed management of the firm. Both artist and designer, she studied at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, now the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and abroad, before marrying William Willett in 1896. In collaboration with their son, she continued the commission for the Military Academy Chapel at West Point, as well as other windows throughout the United States, including the DuPont Memorials at St. John's Cathedral, Wilmington, Delaware, the Hilton and Graham Taylor Chapels at Chicago Theological Seminary, and windows at St. Columba's Church in Washington, D.C., among others. In 1922, she completed a window honoring the life of Lita Sullivan Hoffman, daughter of a prominent Philadelphia family. The window was donated to Our Lady of the Assumption in Stratford, Pennsylvania, by Mr. and Mrs. Francis Sullivan in memory of their beloved daughter, Lita. In December of that same year, before the window was to be installed in the church, it was included in a traveling exhibition by the American Federation of the Arts, which brought it to 6 national museums. The Pennsylvania Museum at Memorial Hall in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, the forerunner to the present-day Philadelphia Museum of Art, was among the most notable of the stops. While creating this window, Her artistic collaboration with her husband continued on even after his death. Following a medieval custom of depicting an individual's likeness in a work of art, she referred to an old photograph of William Willett's painted portrait of Lita Sullivan to render the Virgin's features. The portrait that she used still remains in the Willet Hauser archives, showing that Lita's image was depicted with great realism. She rendered the likeness of Lita's son Albert in the face of the baby Jesus, painting the young child from life. Up to 1930, the Willet Stained Glass and Decorating Company continued as a mother-son firm until the pair failed to settle disagreements regarding the direction of the studio. Anne fired her son Henry that year. She continued to manage the Willet Stained Glass and Decorating Company, while Henry operated the Henry Lee Willet Stained Glass Studio from 1930 to 1934. Then, upon retirement in 1934, Anne sold the studio to Henry Lee, who carried on the family tradition with his son, E. Crosby Willett, as the Willet Stained Glass Studio. There is a photo showing Anne Lee with her son Henry before he left for his grand tour of Europe. After her departure from the stained glass business, she compiled sketches, drawings, and biographical data on her late husband for the Art Reference Collection in the Philadelphia Public Library, now the Free Library of Philadelphia. She also spent time improving the welfare of seamen, including working to better the conditions in the merchant marines, a passion she pursued until the time of her death. She passed away on January 18, 1943, days after she was struck with pneumonia while visiting her daughter, Rachel Marshall English, in Atlanta, Georgia. On the left is William Willett's portrait of Lita Sullivan Hoffman, and on the right, Anne Lee Willett's Annunciation scene featuring Lita's likeness as the face of the Virgin Mary. Henry Lee Willet. Born just a few days shy of the turn of the century, Henry Lee Willet, 1899 to 1983, was educated at the Chestnut Hill Academy in Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania, Princeton University, and the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. After his schooling, Henry traveled to Europe, where he spent several years abroad researching the craft of stained glass before returning to Philadelphia. Like his father, he favored the Gothic tradition and inspired staff artists such as George Cuvier and Marguerite Godin to produce its bolder styling in intense hues. Under Henry's guidance, the company expanded from a regional business to a studio of national and international renown, with completed projects in all 50 states and 14 foreign countries. There is a photo showing Henry Lee Willet with his son, E. Crosby Willett, in the Philadelphia studio, examining iconography for a clerestory design for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. During this time, the studio experimented with new techniques, and in the 1950s was one of the first American studios to design and fabricate faceted glass windows. The Willet Studios also developed the famous sculptured gold window technique and experimented with various methods of laminating stained glass, a technique known as farbagem under Henry's leadership. Henry Lee Willet was an undeniable dynamic force in American stained glass until his death in 1983. There is a photo showing the Henry Lee Willet Stained Glass Studio, which operated from 1930 to 1934, located on Wood Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. E. Crosby Willett. Henry Lee Willett's son, Everett Crosby Willett, known as Crosby, first stepped into his father's studio at the young age of 6. While on a summer camp canoe trip, Crosby, along with 12 other boys, contracted polio. The disease rendered his legs immobile. It wasn't until the fall of 1944, 6 months after recovering from the illness and regaining his walking ability, that Crosby returned to school. Determined to keep his son moving, Henry Lee employed the then 14-year-old as a helper in his studio during the summer break after his first year of high school. His main responsibility was organizing the glass for the studio's 6 glass painters. His pay was 35 cents an hour. He continued to work at the studio over the following 5 summers through his early years of college. By his final summer, he had gained the experience and knowledge equivalent to a full year's apprenticeship. Most valuable to him were his conversations with experts in the field who had worked all over the world and were happy to share their knowledge with the young man, often allowing him to work on their windows. By 1965, he became the 3rd-generation president of the Willet Studios. Under his leadership, Willet windows were created for many of the major churches and cathedrals in the United States, including the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption in San Francisco. He graduated from Germantown Friends School and received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Lafayette College in 1950. He has a distinguished list of achievements, including past president of the Stained Glass Association of America, the American Society for Church Architecture, an artist and board member of Interfaith Forum on Religion, Art, and Architecture, a senior member of the American Society of Appraisers, a member of the Society of Architectural Historians, and an affiliate member of the American Institute of Architects. His Farbagem entry was selected for the Corning Museum New Glass Worldwide exhibition. In 1983, he received an honorary Doctor of Fine Arts degree from Orthodox Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia. In 1985, he received the George Washington Kidd Award from Lafayette College, given to an alumnus of the college who has earned distinction in his or her profession. In 1999, Mr. Willett was elected a Fellow of the Stained Glass Association in recognition of his profound influence on stained glass in America. On behalf of the Stained Glass Association of America, Crosby received the association's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2009, celebrating his lifelong pursuit of excellence in the art and craft of stained glass. Under his direction, Willet Studios and Willet Hauser have worked with many impressive churches in the United States. His lifelong devotion to the studio that his grandfather began continues on at Willet Hauser Architectural Glass Incorporated today. Anne Willett Kellogg. Like her brother Crosby, Anne Willett Kellogg grew up surrounded by the beauty produced by the Willet Studios. She studied at Germantown Friends School and Pine Manor Junior College, later attending the Moore Institute of Design before completing a 4-year apprenticeship in stained glass at the Willet Studio. In 1956, Kellogg had the honor of having her stained glass study titled Prayer featured on the cover of the October issue of the now-defunct Architecture and Design magazine, Progressive Architecture. She worked at the studio for most of her life until the early 1980s, when she, along with fellow Willet artisans Vincent Siriani and Tony Mako, left the Willet Studio to open their own studio. Known as the Anne Willett Stained Glass Atelier, the studio was located in Springhouse, Pennsylvania. Kellogg continued with the atelier until her retirement, leaving Siriani to carry on with the business. Chapter 2. A Family Affair continues. The creation of Willet Hauser Architectural Glass and its evolution to the present. The Minnesota-based Hauser Art Glass Company came to fruition in the years following World War II. During that time, the stained glass windows of the United States had fallen into disrepair after years of neglect, as the metal and glass that would normally be used for their repair was rationed for the war effort. In 1946, recognizing an opportunity to aid many of these churches, James E. Hauser founded the Hauser Art Glass Company in Winona, Minnesota. The Hausers. James E. Hauser. James Edwin Hauser, 1916 to 2004, was described as a man big in spirit, blessed with large hands and broad shoulders, attributes which equipped him to persevere through a life not without its challenges. A child of the Great Depression, he journeyed cross-country to California with his eccentric uncle in search of fortune. The pair worked odd jobs and sold homemade products along the way. After marrying his wife Genevieve in 1938, James joined the Army to serve in the Pacific campaigns of World War II, participating in the occupation of Japan. Upon his return, James focused his self-made entrepreneurial spirit on stained glass, founding the Hauser Art Glass Company. He guided the company on a steady growth pattern, while continuing to specialize in serving small, remotely located churches. Glass artists, specializing in replicating different design styles, joined the studio as the company's projects became larger and more complex. Thanks to his passionate drive for success and gift for sales, the studio grew to become the largest stained glass studio in America. In 1960, the company extended its reach from neighborhood churches to creating moderately priced windows for hotels, restaurants, and private homes. Hauser Art Glass aided over 10,000 churches in caring for their windows. Projects were as minor as repairing or replacing single pieces of glass to complex historic restorations of all the windows of a cathedral. By the 1970s, more churches were calling on Hauser Art Glass Company for repair and restoration than any other studio in the United States. In 1977, the Willet Studio was acquired by the Hauser Art Glass Company, Incorporated, of Winona, Minnesota. E. Crosby Willett continued to serve as senior art director for the Willet Studio, and operations remained at the Philadelphia location in Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania, while Hauser Art Glass Company operations continued in Minnesota. After 1977, the Willet Studio, together with E. Crosby Willett and the second generation of the Hauser family, James A. Hauser and Michael Hauser, continued to maintain the quality that has long been associated with it. In 2005, the company changed its name to Willet Hauser Architectural Glass Incorporated to more accurately reflect the long-term direction of the studio. Mike Hauser. As the son of James E. Hauser, the founder of the Hauser Art Glass Company, Mike Hauser learned the business of stained glass design restoration directly. From an early age, he accompanied his father on window inspection trips throughout the Midwest during summer vacations from school. He later worked on the bench at the studio, learning the craft from the ground up when he wasn't sweeping up after quitting time. Specializing in restoration, he joined the studio as a studio representative in 1972, calling on hundreds of churches and inspecting thousands of stained glass windows throughout the United States. During this time, he also attended law school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In the fall of 1975, he was admitted to the Minnesota State Bar Association. Upon graduation, he continued as studio representative, establishing new markets for the company along the West Coast. Hauser returned to the home office in 1977 to direct on-site crew management. He was a major player in the acquisition of the Willet Studio in 1977 and the merging of the two companies, their responsibilities, and their abilities. Upon the retirement of his father in 1994, Mike became president of the reorganized company. The firm continued to prosper and grow. He managed the purchase of new, larger, and more efficient buildings in both Philadelphia and Winona, creating more effective studio spaces for the artists and craftsmen. He encouraged new techniques that have aided in the development of the artistic services offered by the studio. Mike's leadership continued until his retirement in January 2014. James A. Hauser. As the oldest son of the founder of the Hauser Art Glass Company, James Hauser was associated with stained glass almost all of his life. As a young man, he worked on one of his father's restoration teams, learning the basic skills and techniques of stained glass. His education at the University of Evansville in Evansville, Indiana, included a strong emphasis on art. Hauser has experienced all the positions in a major studio, including designing windows. He would be the first to tell you, though, that his craftspeople and artist associates are much better than he ever could be. He was responsible for establishing the pricing format for every stained glass window produced by Hauser Art Glass Company, Incorporated, and Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated. He has also written hundreds of replacement evaluations for churches, cathedrals, dioceses, and insurance companies. Working directly with prospective clients, he wrote or supervised the writing of specifications for the repair and restoration of windows in thousands of churches throughout the United States. He coordinated the company's standard procedures that are based in part on research into European and American restoration techniques and the advice of European specialists. These restoration procedures at the studio enable coordinated efforts for the restoration of American and European stained glass works. Jim worked until his retirement in January 2014, when the company was purchased by the Phillips family. There is a photo of the brothers, Mike and Jim Hauser. The Phillips family, John Phillips Sr. In November of 1974, the Hausers hired John Phillips Sr. as their new territorial studio consultant for the East, based out of the Pittsburgh area. He quickly learned the business and very successfully represented the studio on the East Coast and throughout the Midwestern states. Phillips Sr. continued with Hauser Art Glass until 1981, when he opened Phillips Stained Glass, which continued on until it was sold in 1990. For him, stained glass was a family affair, as he often took his young son along and taught him about the art and business of stained glass. His son, John Jr., rarely left his father's side as he embraced and learned the many facets of the field. John Phillips Jr. John Jr. eventually came to work for his father and later consulted for other studios and performed contract work for Willet Hauser. In 1997, he and his wife Mary started their own stained glass studio, Associated Crafts, which quickly grew to become one of the largest and most respected restoration studios in the nation. Mary, who once worked in the airline industry as a reservation specialist and later manager, assisted in the studio in the early days of Associated Crafts, eventually performing field work, glazing windows, and on-site repairs with her husband. Additionally, she did all bookkeeping and proposal preparation. There are photographs of John Phillips Sr., John and Mary Phillips, and a photo of John Phillips Sr. and John Phillips Jr. at John and Mary's wedding. In the fall of 2013, the Hausers decided to pursue retirement. Wanting the legacy of the Willets and Hausers to continue, they carefully searched for a replacement who had the knowledge, integrity, and desire to carry on the tradition of their iconic American stained glass studio. They didn't have to search long, for they chose to offer the studio to John Phillips Jr. Having known John since he was 8 years old, they mentored and taught him over the many years and watched him grow in the industry. It was a perfect fit, which Mr. Willett favored. John got the call in October 2013 and took over ownership and operations on January 9, 2014. Along with John and Mary, longtime friend and colleague Robert Bohannon and his wife Diane also invested in the future of Willet Hauser Architectural Glass, Incorporated. There is a photograph of the Phillips family, including John Sr., Arlene, Shelby, John Phillips Jr., J.W., and Mary. Carleen Wieland. Carleen Wieland, sister of John Phillips Jr., manages all of the company's brand marketing. When Carleen was young, she would help stuff envelopes for mailings and plot her dad's sales calls on a map. In 2014, she managed the acquisition of Willet Hauser. With nearly 20 years of marketing and new product development experience, Whelan's consulting role has served as an integral part in forming the public identity of Willet Hauser and Associated Crafts when Associated Crafts purchased Willet Hauser in 2014. Known for her passion, energy, and creativity in all that she chooses to achieve, she has led marketing and new product development in several industries prior to starting her own company, Bedtime for Dogs. Bedtime for Dogs helps pups get to sleep at night naturally with holistic, U.S.-made products. These product lines are distributed nationally. The next generation, Shelby and J.W. Phillips. Following in their parents' footsteps, Shelby and J.W. Phillips are active and valued participants in the family business. Shelby, a graduate of the University of Iowa with a degree in sociology, serves as the Vice President of Human Resources for Willet Hauser Architectural Glass Incorporated and Associated Crafts. A gifted golfer, Shelby set a number of records while playing Division I during her 4 years at the University of Iowa. In addition to her work at Willet Hauser and Associated Crafts, she shares her talent as a golf coach with both junior and accomplished golfers. J.W. has been actively involved in the stained glass industry since he was 11 years old. Much like his father John, J.W.'s first job was to travel with his father to churches and clean up after the removal of stained glass. By the age of 15, he and Shelby would earn money by filling out mailer cards for Associated Crafts leads. At 18, he spent 3 months in Pennsylvania with his grandfather, John Sr., to learn about all of the facets of sales in the stained glass industry. J.W. graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in business management. He worked at Gallo Sales Company in California, where he currently resides, before taking on his current role as Vice President of Operations for Willet Hauser Architectural Glass and Associated Crafts. Chapter 3. The Artist's Lineage. The Willet Hauser Architectural Glass Incorporated has been operated by 3 families through its more than century-long existence. It is the studio's staff and artisans that have remained a constant and, in a sense, a 4th family for this long-standing studio. Many of these individuals are no longer with Willet Hauser today, but their rich artistic tradition, inherited from a lineage of artists before them, is present in much of the work that the studio produces presently. The work of 3 past artisans, Mike Susko, Elaine Bell Susko, and Jim McConnell, has made an everlasting impression on their contemporaries. The majority of the information on the preceding pages was compiled through personal interviews with John Phillips, Jr. in 2014. Mike Susko. Over 50 years ago, a young Mike Susko was working for Quaker City Glass, a small stained glass studio near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Though he had not been in the industry long, he was aware that the Willet Studio was regarded as the place to be for those in the field of stained glass. Fortunately, his drive and persistence proved successful, as he was recognized as the kind of talent the Willet Studios was seeking, and offered him a position within the intensive Willet Studios apprenticeship program. During his 4-year apprenticeship, he was sponsored and mentored by master craftsman Horace Nathans. Horace took his sponsorship seriously and diligently worked to mold Susko into a great artisan. During this time, he learned everything from the art of faceted glass fabrication to glass painting and installation. His favorite technique was leaded glass, for which he is known. For over 20 years, Susko was charged with the bulk of the studio's installations, including those for Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the Washington, D.C. Latter-day Saints Temple in Kensington, Maryland, the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the United States Military Academy in West Point, New York. When asked about his favorite installation, he recalled the excitement of being 120 feet up in St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City. He explained, that the artwork there is on a grand scale, allowing it to be viewed from the floor of the structure by the cathedral's visitors. His experience at the cathedral offered a rare and appreciated view of the cathedral's glass from high above the ground. One of Susko's favorite things to do after the completion of an installation was to sit back in a pew and observe the finished product. While doing so, he was able to enjoy the beautiful project he had a hand in creating, and also take a moment to contemplate and critique his own work to carry those lessons into the next project. He admits that his greatest accomplishment at the studio was hiring the young artist Elaine Bell. Elaine wanted to bring her painting ability to the medium of glass. Concerned that her painting skills might not translate to the glass medium, he was reluctant at first to hire Elaine. As he recalls, it didn't take him long to realize what a good decision that was. The two were married 7 years later. During his 50-plus years at the Willet Studios until his retirement in 2013, Mike had several opportunities to leave the industry, but refused each time. He admitted with a smile that if he had a chance to do it all again, he wouldn't change a thing. There is a photo, a lead shop overview, Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania, circa 1960s. Elaine Bell Susko. Elaine Bell Susko's work at Willet Hauser Architectural Glass Incorporated began in 1993. She is a descendant of a long line of artists on her mother's side of the family, including the 19th century Belgian painter Louis Dubois, a founding member of La Société Libérée des Beaux-Arts, or Free Society of Fine Arts, founded in 1868. It is rumored that her grandmother, Annabel Lee Thomas, worked for William Willett, the studio's founder. Her mother, Leonie Bell, was a well-known and highly regarded rosarian and botanical illustrator. Elaine Susko studied fine art at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and also attended night classes in painting at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. During her summers, she worked as an assistant to Willet Studio's librarian, Helen Weiss. She had been aware of the Willet Studios since a young age, when her mother would take her to St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Church in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, which houses a unique collection of early Willet windows designed by William Willett and fabricated by Ann Lee following William's death. During her early days at the studio in the 1960s, while on summer breaks, she gave studio tours to visitors and traveled to local churches with Weiss to photograph stained glass for the studio's slide library. After 2 summers working as an assistant to her, she decided to focus on stained glass as a career, and to that end, she applied to and was accepted as a student of the diploma course in architectural glass at Swansea College of Art in Swansea, Wales, United Kingdom. In the 1970s, this course had an excellent reputation for teaching both the art and craft of stained glass. She was exposed to opportunities exploring the design, fabrication, and installation of leaded and faceted glass. Glass history was also a component of the course. While in Europe, Susko had the opportunity to visit many cathedrals, including Wells, Bristol, Ely, Durham, Salisbury, Canterbury, Chartres, and Cologne, as well as a myriad of churches and public buildings where stained glass was used as an architectural feature. This exposure served as the foundation for her chosen career. For a time in the 1980s, she operated a studio in London, England. While there, she also designed for Goddard and Gibbs Studio on a freelance basis and designed and constructed windows for a number of private homes, as well as the Polka Theatre, a children's theatre in Wimbledon. Her work was featured in the 1982 Prophecy and Vision exhibition at the Bristol City Museum and Art Gallery. After taking time off to raise her son, she returned to Willet Studio in 1994 at the behest of Helene Weiss to work as a painter. Although she was familiar with the painting process from her studies at Swansea, she spent the beginning of her painting career at Willet, dedicated to reacquainting herself with the art form. For the first 6 months, she worked assiduously on the same background to better learn how to handle the paint. Susko believes that when one learns from someone, they learn not only from the instructor, but from the person who taught them. Having multiple in-studio mentors, Susko's work reaped the rewards of a variety of artistic lineages, each helping to shape her own artistic skills. Willet painter Rose Martin, who trained under Willet painter Ray DeHaven, served as her sponsor and mentor. Besides the practical aspects of mixing and applying paint, she was at times able to simply watch Rose paint, or, as glass painting is a reverse process, remove paint. Though Martin did not have formal art training, Susko benefited from Martin's natural talent, her patience, and tactfulness as a teacher. To Susko, Martin imbued her faces with a gentle humility. When viewing Martin's work, Susko can always recognize her windows, not from distinguishing line work or any other learned painting technique, but from that same gentle humility forever captured in Martin's faces. Another greatly influential artist to her is longtime Willet artist Kenny Crocker, who was trained at Whipple Studios in Devon, England, before moving to the United States. She fondly recalls Crocker traveling to the studio when he was assigned to paint one of his designs. To her, this was a great honor, as painters do not generally care to divulge their secrets. This attitude does not come from any sense of selfishness, she explains, but from the fact that their skills are learned over a long period of time, and they want to make sure a novice painter is worth passing these learned skills onto. As such, she learned to paint with Crocker's unique and styled aesthetic, but naturally only adopted it over time. Other artists she credits as being an influence on her growth as a painter are Ronnie Shaw and Vince Filippone. She remembers Ronnie as being incredibly adept at painting windows that were meant to be looked at from a distance. This is a skill, she states. Many painters today come from a background in illustration, where the work is meant to be looked at closely and fine details are important. As is common with much stained glass, the outside light streaming in is so strong that in many cases these fine details are obscured when the window is installed. Watching Ron paint, I learned what was important to emphasize and what was not. Ron was really good at using glass paint to make the glass sparkle. His sponsor was, she continues, I think, Benoit Gilles-Saul, and Ron mentioned that part of his apprenticeship was going to the art museum with Benoit and looking at paintings. She regards Vince Filippone as an amazing painter. Like many painters, he joined the Willet Studio when the famous D'Ascenzo Studio in Philadelphia, where he had painted, closed its doors in the 1950s. She came to know him and remembers his ease with the paint. It was such a pleasure to watch a panel take shape under his breath. He was able to do an inscription freehand, which, believe me, takes considerable skill. On the bottom of page 20 are 2 examples of Elaine's stylistic range of painting on glass. Like many stained glass artists, she learned the majority of her skills on the job, noting there is something new learned every day from the old. Often an old window would come in with broken pieces, she explains, and in those days, artisans would paint a new piece to replace the damaged one. She credits this painting of repair pieces as a very good way to learn, since the painter is challenged to figure out how to match the new piece with the old. Studying the work of other studios is helpful, she advises. Living in the Philadelphia area, she is fortunate that she can do exactly that in her backyard, with the many beautiful older churches in the region, containing an almost endless source of inspiration and education. The studio's long-standing commission at the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist in Spokane, Washington, stands out as a more recent learning experience for her. In 2004, the cathedral ordered 10 new clerestory windows from Willet Hauser. Already having a collection of stained glass windows by Charles Connick that were installed before the studio had closed, the studio was challenged to create new windows that would fit with the aesthetic of the Connick studio. In order to do so, Elaine studied a lot of Connick work to get the feel of his painting style. It was a challenge, she admits, since the Connick studio produced some fabulous work. A notable project was the recreation of the nave windows for the rebuilt Church of the Redeemer in Longport, New Jersey. The church burned to the ground in June of 2012 during a devastating storm, losing all but a few panels of their early, circa 1940s Willet Studio stained glass collection. The glass that was salvaged, along with a handful of slides of the original windows archived in the Willet Hauser Library, gave Elaine just enough to work with when recreating the church's nave windows. As she explains, the windows were designed by George Gugert and painted by old-school Willet painters during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So, by recreating these windows, I am, in a sense, learning from the original painters. I realize that it is not possible to provide an exact copy, and my aim is to recreate the feel of the original work. Our glass selector did just a wonderful job with seeking out glass for these new windows, and a good selection helps the painter. Like her mentor, Rose Martin, Susko strives to instill a sense of humanity and pathos into her figures. She credits her Christian faith in helping her to ponder the relationships between the figures she is painting. In an effort to keep her work from being dull or contrived, she approaches each new window with a determination to make it better than the last. With some stained glass subjects more popular than others, and therefore depicted more often, she uses different textures or techniques to add variety to her work. However, she reminds us, it is important to not let the technique overpower the subject. Susko retired from Willet Hauser in 2014. Jim McConnell. Jim McConnell began his career with the Willet Studios in 1958, before leaving to serve in the U.S. Navy from 1963 to 1965. After his return, McConnell left again in 1969 to start his own studio with partner Robert Hayes. He returned again in 1980 after Hayes suffered health problems. McConnell joined the studio during a time when it employed over 100 people, many of whom had backgrounds in some of the most highly regarded studios in the field. As an apprentice, he realized early on that it was to his benefit to learn something of value from nearly every one of those artisans, even some he admits he may not have cared for personally. Those artisans that stick out in his mind are Henry Lee Willett, his sponsor John Stanton, and Horace Nathans, Mike Susko's sponsor, whom the two shared. Others are John LaHoven, the longtime chief color selector under whom McConnell worked for several years, and longtime pattern maker Dick Stewart, whom McConnell remembers as a stickler for details. McConnell remembers glazing foreman Sam Long wanting things done right. Spending several years in the patterning and glass selection department allowed him to collaborate with the studio's designers and painters, who gave him much insight from their angle of things. He recalls Tony Mako, Kenny Crocker, Ray DeHaven, Joe Diano, and Arnold Trebergs as being some of the best. During his long career with Willett, Jim held a number of positions within the studio. Between the year he began his apprenticeship in April 1958 until he entered the Navy in July 1963, he spent time in every department in the studio, but mostly in glazing, cutting, and installation. When he returned to the Willet Studio in 1980, after a decade of running his own studio, he was hired by the studio's general manager, Bill Stewart, to serve as pattern maker. This title was eventually changed to chief engineer with the acquisition of the studio by Hauser Art Glass. After the retirement of long-term glass selector Fred Keebler in the late 1980s, Jim took on the role of chief glass selector. Though the role was eventually taken over by others, he remained the glass buyer until shortly before his retirement in 2008. Given his broad knowledge and experience with many roles within the studio, McConnell found it difficult to choose a favorite technique or process. He generally enjoyed working on whatever came his way, seeing each new project as an opportunity to learn something more than he knew the day before. On page 23 is a photograph of one of Jim's favorite projects, a panel depicting Venice, fabricated for the Armstrong Browning Gallery, Baylor University, Waco, Texas. I always enjoyed working on things that presented something of a challenge, whether it was new work or restoration, he said. One project that he fondly remembers as presenting such a challenge that turned out quite well was the creation window designed by artist David Pushkin for B'nai Jacob Synagogue in Charleston, West Virginia. It, along with the leaded glass windows for the Armstrong Browning Library at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, remains one of his favorite commissions. During his 50 years with the studio, he was witness to a number of changes and evolutions within the company. One of the biggest changes that he recalls was the shift from an almost exclusively male workforce to a mostly female workforce. As he recalls, it was interesting to see that this change brought with it a significant difference in employee interaction. He also witnessed the aesthetic shift in client tastes from the strong, deep colors of the Gothic revival to what McConnell describes as the later, more airy work. Another positive change was the studio's radical upscaling of restoration work. As he remembers, Willett did almost no repair work in the early days. He believes that change is the key to the studio's long-term survival. Yet at the same time, he warns, one must stay true to the company's ideals. One of McConnell's favorite memories from his years at the studio is his involvement in the 1964 New York World's Fair Hall of Science project. The faceted glass commission was the largest the studio had ever undertaken until that time. I hadn't expected to be part of it, since I was on active duty in the United States Navy during the period when the work was being produced. Just prior to a 6-month deployment to the Mediterranean, I was able to get leave. If I was at all unsure as to how I would spend my 2 weeks at home, I was about to find out, for coming towards me in the airport concourse was a familiar shock of red hair. The slightly hunched-over man on a mission, with his head down, could only be Henry Lee himself. We exchanged greetings, and I told him I was home on leave. That was it. He wouldn't hear of my being in town without pitching in to lend a hand with the glass cutting. In those days, we hand-cut all the faceted glass with hammers and a lead block. Henry was soon off again, on his way to distant parts, architects to see, committees to meet, etc. I also had my marching orders, recalled Jim. One thing that stands out in my mind about Mr. Willett, I never called him Henry like the old-timers, was an incident that testified to his phenomenal memory. It must have been 1981 or 82, when an inquiry had come in from a church in Atlanta, Georgia, where we had done work many years before. Henry happened to be nearby as I looked for the file. Offhandedly, I mentioned to him what I was doing. "Oh, yes," he said, "I remember that job." And he began to rattle off to me all about the window we had done, the name of the donor, the names of the people on the committee, and the more he talked, the more he remembered. We hadn't done any work there since 1926. On page 24, there is a photograph of Jim McConnell in the patterning department.